I'm Julie Pace, Washington Bureau Chief for the Associated Press, and this is Ground Game. The coronavirus pandemic ranks among one of the most consequential stories ever covered by the Associated Press in its 170-year history. Here to take you inside the outbreak is AP's Ralph Russo.
From the Associated Press, this is Inside the Outbreak. I'm Ralph Russo. Today is Tuesday, May 5th. Britain has become the first European country to report more than 30,000 COVID deaths. In Russia, infections are rising sharply, but in South Korea, the top professional baseball league there has begun to play games, and they're being televised live to starve sports fans here in the United States. On today's episode of Inside the Outbreak, the race to find a vaccine for COVID-19 is on, and it involves about 100 research groups around the world. AP medical writer Lauran Neergaard joins us to discuss the pursuit of a way to make humans immune to a new virus which has killed more than 250,000 worldwide. Government leaders and scientists talk hopefully about having a vaccine in the next year or so, but the reality is no one really knows when the breakthrough will happen. History suggests it will take 12 to 18 months, with the clock having started back in January. AP medical writer Lauran Neergaard joins us today to talk about coronavirus vaccine research and where things stand. Thank you, Lauran, for taking a little time out of your day. Let's jump right to it and start with Vaccine 101. What goes into a vaccine?
All vaccines start with a recipe. To make that recipe, the very first decision that researchers have to make is, what's the target? Vaccines are supposed to train the immune system to recognize when it encounters a germ in real life and quickly react to block it. So decision number one for fighting the virus that causes COVID-19 was that most vaccines are going to target the spiky protein that covers the virus's surface. That spike protein is what latches onto human cells and lets the virus burrow inside them. Then once they've got a target, researchers have to decide what technology to use to make the vaccine. Traditionally, vaccines were made by growing large batches of virus in a lab and then either killing it or weakening it. And for some diseases, that works very well. Measles vaccine is one of the best vaccines the world has. Many flu shots are killed vaccine. That's pretty labor intensive. It takes a long time to grow virus. And for this particular coronavirus, it takes high security laboratories to safely handle it. But there are a few candidates that are being explored that are inactivated or killed virus vaccines. But today we're seeing a lot of vaccines for COVID-19 being created with newer technologies. Some of the candidates are made simply by copying the genetic code the virus uses to make spike protein. There's no virus involved, so no chance of anyone becoming infected. You simply inject that code. It's often called messenger RNA. And the person's own cells act like a little factory and make some copies of spike protein to prime the body in case the real virus ever comes along. There's a RNA vaccine made by the National Institutes of Health. That was the first one to enter U.S. clinical trials. Pfizer today opened the U.S. arm of a trial that's testing some similar RNA vaccines. Another new technology is to use a different harmless virus, like one of the viruses that causes the common cold, to carry spike protein into the body. And that's the approach that's being used in Britain by the University of Oxford. So there are these different recipes that are coming up and that are being tried, because nobody knows which is going to be the best approach for this particular virus.
How many coronavirus vaccine candidates are in the early stages?
Depending on how you count, today there are between 8 and 11 vaccine candidates in human trials in the US, China, and Europe. I say depending on how you count because that study that Pfizer is doing with the German company BioNTech is comparing 4 somewhat similar candidates in the same study. And then there are another handful of candidates that are going to begin the first in human studies in May, June, or July.
So you mentioned hundreds of researchers in your story working on this. To quote Dr. Anthony Fauci from your story, he talked about shots on goal, right? You have to have a lot of shots on goal to possibly score here. That would lead me to believe there are about 8 to 10 candidates, that some of these researchers are working on parallel tracks. Would that be a fair way to assess it?
That is a fair way to assess it. What happens before you get, as you're making that recipe that I talked about, you're doing a lot of laboratory research, what's called preclinical research. You've got to actually work with your candidate in cells in lab dishes and see if it looks like it's going to actually be a viable candidate. There are animal studies that are involved, some of which have to happen before you move into trials in people, some of which in this crisis are being compressed and done simultaneously. So there's a whole list of other vaccine candidates that may eventually, as this moves forward, also come into human testing. And then there are others that, whether they get to human testing or not, may fall by the wayside. But once you get into human testing, the very first studies have to look for safety, for obvious side effects. They're not going to catch anything rare, probably, but that gives you the confidence to then gradually test more people, and you start checking their blood for signs that the immune system is being revved up the way that scientists think is protective. But the real test is very tricky. That's when you take even larger groups of people and you enroll them in studies in areas where the virus is still widely circulating. So not people who are being told to stay home and avoid exposure like they are today, but seeing if real world exposure, those who are vaccinated get infected less often than those who are not.
And just to follow up on that, it sounds like we are a while away from that, right? From those type of tests.
So some of these mid-stage tests that are going to be going on over the summer actually are several thousand people in them. And so depending on whether they get a strong signal that a vaccine works, depends then what you could do in the fall, whether you would move to the more traditional large-scale vaccine studies, or whether you might have areas that say we're going to kind of use emergency authorizations and vaccinate maybe health workers and see what happens. So there are strategies that are under discussion to speed things up even more, depending on what the case is as we get through the summer and the fall. In the US, you hear researchers like Dr. Fauci talking about, usually he has said from the very beginning that best case scenario would be 12 to 18 months for a vaccine. January would mark 12 months since the National Institutes of Health began working on its candidate. So it just sort of depends on what happens with both the virus, whether things go perfectly with all of these trials over the summer and fall, as to whether we go to traditional vaccine, large-scale tests, or some sort of emergency situation to try and get a final answer.
You mentioned in your reporting that for coronavirus, there is no blueprint to a vaccine. Explain what that means, and also how might we have missed an opportunity a few years back to possibly get, I'll use the word head start on the fight we face right now, but you can correct me if I'm a little wrong on that terminology.
So different types of vaccines work better in some virus families than others. There are coronaviruses that just cause common colds, and we don't have any vaccines for them. But then back in 2003, there was an outbreak of what's called SARS, which is a cousin of the new virus that's causing COVID-19. And that was a really dangerous outbreak. It had a high death rate, and people scrambled to make vaccines for it. There were some animal studies of some of those first candidates that hinted at some safety problems. But whether those were real and whether the vaccine really could have protected, no one ever found out, because SARS disappeared and funding for SARS vaccines dried up. Now you fast forward to 2012, and another cousin of COVID-19 popped up. This one was called MERS. And that one still occurs occasionally in the Middle East. And there are vaccines that have been tried in very early, mostly animal studies for a MERS vaccine. Fortunately, that work was going on because some of the RNA vaccines that are now being tried basically were tweaked from earlier MERS attempts. The thing is, we don't know if any of those MERS vaccines would have worked either, because the ones that were furthest in development only reached the very first small safety tests. But at least that was a little bit of a recipe for some places to follow and say, we're going to try this approach.
So once a vaccine is found, and I'm going to jump a little bit ahead here. Once a vaccine is found, how do we ensure that it is quickly distributed and readily available for everyone, not just here in the US, but everyone around the world? Because I'm thinking that, with the high demand and the urgency, this could create some real tension over who gets what and when.
Absolutely. You're seeing some concern about that already. The World Health Organization and really public health officials around the world have made very clear that this vaccine can't just be for rich countries. It has to be shared equally with poor countries. You're going to have to vaccinate the entire world. And that is something that's, we've never had the entire world's population be naive and therefore need that many doses all at once. And there will not be that many doses all at once. So once a vaccine is found, there will be a certain supply. And there'll have to be plans to essentially ration it and decide who's going to get the first amounts that are available and how. And as you ratchet up the needed supply. Now, to address that ahead of time, there is a very unusual thing happening where a lot of vaccine manufacturers are taking a gamble, and they're starting to produce doses, lots of doses, millions of doses now before they know if the candidate they're betting on is actually going to work. So they stand to lose a lot of money if, in fact, that candidate fails and they have to throw out those pre-made doses. But it's something that companies themselves and that government agencies, which are funding some of that work as well, have decided is a needed gamble in order to be in the best position to shave a few months off waiting for production if you actually find a vaccine that is safe and effective enough to go ahead and start mass vaccinations.
I want to squeeze in one last question, because what you just said was fascinating, because while I'm sure researchers and doctors and scientists all around the world are working toward this with the highest goals as far as humanitarian relief, the fact of the matter is the company that discovers this vaccine will be in line for, I would imagine, a massive payday. How does that work?
Absolutely. There will be a payday at some point. I think all of that is still left to be discovered. But what you are seeing is that there's a move in different countries to say, we need to have our own in-country manufacturing capability so that we're not all waiting on, manufacturer X in a certain country to ship everywhere else. First of all, that couldn't be done. There's just no way that one company, one candidate really conceivably could be enough. So that's where you're going to see some of that tension. Dr. Richard Hatchett, who heads an organization called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, it's a nonprofit that's funding a lot of the vaccines that are currently in trials. He has said that he's concerned about what he calls vaccine nationalism, where elected leaders of countries are going to feel a natural obligation to protect their own citizens' lives, and yet they're also being asked to share around the world. So I think you're seeing some of that play out already with the idea that countries want to have some production on their own soil.
Lauran Neergaard is an AP medical writer. Lauran, thank you so much for joining us today, providing such great insight, and please stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you.
At apnews.com, today's One Good Thing feature is a story about cinnamon rolls. Whitney Rutz of Oregon started making her giant cinnamon rolls just to lift her own spirits. She started showing off her sweet creations on social media. They measure 12 inches across and weigh more than 5 pounds. She began auctioning them off among friends, and now they have raised more than $30,000 for the Oregon Food Bank. That's enough for more than 90,000 meals. and many of the highest bidders are requesting that the roles be donated to healthcare workers. You can read that story and all of AP's coronavirus outbreak coverage at apnews.com.
That's it for this episode of Ground Game. We'll be here every step of the way during this extraordinary moment in American politics and American life, giving you all the news you need to know. Be sure to tell a friend about us, and please subscribe on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. Some of the details of our discussion may have changed by the time you hear this. For up-to-date developments on all of your news, head over to apnews.com. From the Westwood One Podcast Network.